Most people who watched Norbit remember the scenes that made it into the film. The characters, the broad comedic set pieces, the moments built for an audience sitting in a theater or at home with the movie playing in the background. What almost no one knows is that somewhere between two of those scenes, in a quiet corner of the set that no camera was pointed at, something passed between Katt Williams and Eddie Murphy that neither man ever discussed in an interview, a press junket, or any of the dozens of conversations either of them had about the film in the years that followed. It wasn't a secret in the sense of something hidden on purpose. It was simply the kind of moment that exists only for the people inside it, too small to mention, too personal to explain, and over too quickly to become a story. But for the people who happened to be nearby that day, it was the kind of moment that stayed with them, even if they couldn't always say exactly why. To understand what made that quiet corner of the set significant, it helps to understand what a film set like the one for Norbit actually looked and felt like in the mid-2000s, and where both men stood in their careers at the time. By the mid-2000s, film productions of this scale operated on a schedule built around efficiency above almost everything else. A single day of shooting could involve dozens of setups, each one requiring its own lighting configuration, camera placement, and blocking rehearsal. For the actors involved, especially those carrying significant roles, a shooting day was less a continuous performance than a series of short, intense bursts of work separated by long stretches of waiting. Waiting for lights to be adjusted, waiting for a camera to be repositioned, waiting for a scene partner to finish in hair and makeup. Waiting simply because that's what large productions required. These waiting periods created a strange kind of social environment. On one hand, a film set was crowded, dozens, sometimes over 100 people, all working simultaneously, all moving with purpose, all part of a machine that needed to keep running on schedule. Sound stages during this era were vast, cavernous spaces filled with the low hum of generators and the sound of crew members calling out instructions, moving equipment, adjusting the towering lighting rigs that hung from the ceiling like a second sky built specifically for the cameras below. On the other hand, within that crowd, there were pockets of stillness, corners of sound stages, areas just outside the main lit set, where actors not currently needed could step away from the noise for a few minutes. These pockets weren't designed spaces. They were simply wherever the activity happened not to be at any given moment, shifting throughout the day as the production's focus moved from one setup to the next. In these quieter corners, actors often found themselves doing very little, sitting in canvas chairs with their names stenciled on the back, flipping through pages of a script, or simply standing, arms crossed, watching the organized chaos of a crew resetting a scene. It wasn't glamorous. For all the attention a film like this would eventually receive once it reached theaters, the actual experience of making it was, for long stretches, simply about waiting, patiently, quietly, in whatever space happened to be available. For Norbit specifically, the production brought together a cast that included performers from very different corners of comedy. Eddie Murphy, by this point, had been a major figure in American comedy and film for more than 2 decades. His career had moved through stand-up, through Saturday Night Live, through a string of films that had defined comedic performance for an entire generation, and through the kind of name recognition that meant audiences arrived at a film already knowing, in a sense, who he was before the movie even started. He carried that history with him onto every set he worked on, not as a weight necessarily, but as a kind of context that shaped how people around him related to him, often without anyone consciously thinking about it. Crew members who had worked with him for years moved around him with the easy familiarity of long routine. Newer cast members, by contrast, often carried a kind of quiet awareness of his presence, not nervousness exactly, but a heightened sense of who was in the room, the way anyone might feel working alongside someone whose career had shaped the very medium they were now part of. Katt Williams, by contrast, was at a different point entirely. His reputation in stand-up was growing quickly during this period. Audiences and other comedians increasingly recognized him as someone with a voice unlike anyone else working at the time. But film work was a different world, with its own rhythms, its own unspoken hierarchies, its own ways of moving through a day that had little in common with the stage. On a sound stage, there was no audience to read, no room to win over with timing and instinct. There was only the camera, the script, and the long stretches of waiting in between. Being on a set with someone like Eddie Murphy meant being in proximity to a kind of career longevity that very few people in comedy ever achieved. Not as an abstract idea, but as an actual person, standing nearby, between takes, in the same ordinary low that affected everyone on set, regardless of who they were. For a newer performer navigating that environment, there was often an unspoken question hovering in the background of every interaction. How much space was appropriate to take up? How much conversation was welcome? How to be present on a set shared with someone whose work had been part of the cultural landscape for decades without it becoming awkward or overly deferential. Most of the time, that question never needed an answer, because most of the time, there simply wasn't an opportunity for it to come up. Schedules kept people apart. Different scenes meant different call times. The natural rhythm of a film set didn't often produce moments where two people from very different points in their careers ended up alone together with nothing in particular to do. What made this particular day different wasn't anything dramatic happening in front of the cameras. By most accounts, it was an ordinary shooting day. Multiple scenes, the usual rhythm of setups and resets, nothing that stood out in the production reports or call sheets that governed how these days were organized. The significance of what happened that day existed entirely outside of what the schedule recorded. During one of the longer resets, the kind that happens when a scene requires a more involved lighting change, when the crew needs extra time to reposition equipment without disrupting the actor's concentration, both men found themselves, separately, drifting toward the same quiet corner of the soundstage. Neither had planned to be there. It was simply where the open space happened to be at that moment, away from the cluster of crew members working around the main set, far enough from the noise that conversation, if it happened, wouldn't compete with the sound of equipment being moved. For a few minutes, it was just the two of them. What was said in those minutes has never been fully described by either man. In any interview, any retrospective, any conversation about the film that either of them gave afterward. What is known, pieced together from people who were nearby, close enough to register that something was happening without being close enough to hear what exactly was being said, is that it wasn't a long exchange. It wasn't formal. There was no sense, from the outside, that anything significant was occurring. Just two men standing near each other, talking quietly, in the kind of unremarkable posture that describes almost every conversation that happens on a film set during a break. But there was something about it that people who saw it from a distance remembered afterward, Not because of what was said, since nobody outside the conversation could have known that, but because of how it looked. There was an ease to it, not the careful, slightly performative ease that sometimes exists when people on a set are aware they might be observed, but something quieter than that. Two people who, for those few minutes, weren't thinking about cameras, schedules, or anything beyond the conversation itself. Someone passing by with an armful of cable might have glanced over without quite registering what they were seeing. Just two cast members talking, the most ordinary sight on any set. And yet, for the few people who happened to look a little longer, there was something about the stillness of it, the lack of any performance in either man's posture, that made it stand out against the constant motion of everything else happening around them. For Katt Williams, that quiet corner of the set represented something that wasn't really about the conversation's content at all. It was about proximity. The simple, almost incidental fact of standing near someone whose career had spanned decades, whose name had meant something to audiences since before Katt Williams had started performing, and having that proximity feel for those few minutes completely ordinary. Not intimidating, not formal, just two people standing in a quiet corner of a soundstage, the way anyone might. For Eddie Murphy, the moment likely carried a different kind of weight, or perhaps no particular weight at all, which in its own way says something. By this point in his career, he had worked alongside countless performers, on countless sets, in countless quiet corners exactly like this one. If this moment registered as anything notable to him, it would have been as one of many such moments. A brief, easy exchange with someone he was working alongside, the kind of thing that happens constantly on film sets and is rarely thought about again. And that, in some ways, is exactly what makes the moment worth telling. Not because it was extraordinary to either man involved, but because of what it represented to the people who happened to witness it from a distance. A glimpse of something that doesn't usually get seen. Audiences who watch films like Norbit see the performances, the scenes, the finished product assembled from hundreds of small pieces of footage. What they don't see is everything that happens in between. The waiting, the resets, the quiet corners where, occasionally, something human happens that has nothing to do with what's being filmed. When the reset was finished, and the crew called everyone back to their positions, both men returned to the set, to their marks, to the scene that needed to be filmed. The conversation, whatever it had been, ended the way these things end on film sets, not with any sense of conclusion, just with the practical necessity of getting back to work. The day continued, the scenes got filmed, the production moved on to whatever was next on the schedule. Neither Katt Williams nor Eddie Murphy ever brought up that specific moment publicly in the years that followed. There's no indication that either of them thought of it as significant enough to mention, and, in a sense, that's exactly the point. Most of what happens on a film set, even the parts that feel meaningful in the moment, don't become stories. They simply happen. And then they're absorbed into the much larger experience of making a film, indistinguishable afterward from dozens of other small interactions that occurred the same day. But for the people who happened to see it, crew members, other cast members, anyone close enough to notice two performers standing quietly together in a corner of the soundstage, it became one of those small, specific memories that occasionally surface years later, when someone is asked about what it was like working on a film like that one. Not because of what was said, but because of what it looked like. Two people from very different points in comedic history sharing an ordinary moment of quiet in the middle of a busy day, with no audience and no expectation that anyone would ever ask about it. What that moment reveals about Katt Williams isn't about ambition or ladder climbing or any of the things that might be assumed about a younger performer finding himself near someone more established. It's something quieter, the simple ability to be present in a moment like that without needing to make it into something more than it was. He didn't turn it into an anecdote. He didn't reference it in interviews to establish a connection to someone more famous. It existed briefly, and then it was over, exactly as these moments usually are. What it reveals about Eddie Murphy is similarly understated. Not a grand gesture of mentorship, not a dramatic passing of wisdom from one generation to the next, but something closer to ordinary decency. The willingness to share a quiet corner of a soundstage with someone, to let a conversation happen without making it about anything in particular, without performing generosity or warmth for an audience that wasn't there. Sometimes the most telling thing about a person isn't what they do when they know they're being watched, but what they do in the moments when they assume no one is paying attention at all. Looking back at that day now, what stands out isn't the film itself, or even the specific scenes that were shot before and after that break. What stands out is the corner, the quiet space at the edge of a busy soundstage, the kind of place that exists on every film set and is noticed by almost no one, where for a few minutes, two performers from very different eras of comedy stood near each other and talked about something that neither of them ever explained. That's the part of the story most people never heard. Not because it was hidden, but because it was never the kind of thing that needed telling. Until now, when a handful of people who happened to be standing close enough to notice finally describe what they saw. Two men, a quiet corner, and a few minutes that belonged entirely to them.